I bought my lakeside cabin for one reason: winter ice fishing. While everyone else dreaded the hard freeze each year, I waited for it the way kids wait for Christmas. I imagined quiet mornings on the ice, a thermos of coffee steaming beside me, the sun rising like a pale coin behind the pines. And for the first 2 winters, I lived my dream without issue. Then the HOA got a new president, Marlene. If passive-aggressive yard signs had a human form, it would be her. She arrived armed with binders, bylaws, and the absolute conviction that she knew what was best for everyone within a 3-mile radius. It all started when she approached me on a Saturday morning. I had just drilled my fishing hole, humming to myself. "Excuse me," she called, trudging toward me in her brand-new snow boots. "You can't do that." "Do what?" I asked, hardly looking up. "That," she pointed dramatically, toward the 12-inch hole in the ice as if it were a sinkhole to the underworld. "Ice fishing is now prohibited." I thought she was joking, but then she pulled out a neatly laminated document. "It's a safety risk and an insurance liability," she explained. "We passed the rule last week." "Funny," I said, "because the lake is on my property. But the HOA has jurisdiction over all communal aesthetics. Holes in the ice are unsightly. Unsightly. A hole in the ice, on my lake." I stared at her, half expecting her to start laughing. She didn't. "You have until tomorrow to fill it in," she said. "We'll be monitoring." That night I reread every HOA document. She was technically right. They could regulate visible alterations to natural spaces during community event seasons. They'd slipped that in years ago to stop someone from carving a giant smiley face in the community hiking trail. But here's what Marlene didn't seem to realize. I also knew the law, and more importantly, I knew how much the HOA relied on this lake for their precious winter. Events, polar bear plunges, ice sculpting contests, charity skate-a-thons, all centered right on my property. Their events weren't on common grounds. They rented my lake every winter through an agreement signed long before. I bought the place. I shrugged it off at the time because the income covered my property taxes. But now it was leverage. So instead of filling in my fishing hole, I did the opposite. I drilled another, and another, and another. A dozen neat little circles across the lake. Marlene lost her mind. And by Monday morning, I had a plan forming, one that would make sure no HOA board ever tried to tell a property owner what they could and couldn't do on their own lake again. The confrontation happened during the HOA's emergency winter meeting, which Marlene had called at the community center. I arrived late carrying a thermos, a fishing rod, and a smug sense of inevitability. The room buzzed with mild panic, mostly from homeowners who didn't understand why a perfectly good ice sculpture contest might implode. Marlene waved her binder like a weapon. "We need to discuss the fishing situation. Mr. Thompson has been—" She paused dramatically, drilling unauthorized holes in the ice. I raised my hand. "Actually, I'm exercising my rights as the lake owner. These holes are on my property." The room went silent. People shifted uneasily in folding chairs. I continued. "Let's be clear. The lake itself is private property, purchased with clear deeds. The HOA has no legal authority to ban ice fishing on my lake, period." A few heads turned toward Marlene, who looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. "That's not how we've done things before," she stammered. I leaned forward. "Exactly. But legality doesn't care about tradition." Then came the real fun. I'd spent the past 2 nights researching every HOA statute, local ordinance, and state law regarding property rights, lakes, and recreational access. With a flourish, I pulled out a stack of printed documents. "Here," I said. "This is a cease and desist notice for anyone attempting to enforce that ban. It cites state property law, HOA governance restrictions, and precedent cases about recreational rights on private lakes. Essentially, if anyone steps onto my ice to shut down fishing, they're trespassing." Murmurs filled the room. Marlene's lips were pursed so tightly I feared they might snap. One of the board members whispered to another, "He might be right." I smiled. "And since the HOA relies on this lake for winter events, here's the kicker. Any attempt to proceed with your ice-centric events without my permission is legally risky. You could be liable if someone slips or falls near one of the fishing holes." Heads turned. Even the grumbling, Snow sculptors were paying attention now. I had gone from nuisance neighbor to major legal. Threat in under 5 minutes, Marlene opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I continued, enjoying the tension. I have no intention of shutting down events, well, except those that require perfect ice conditions. My fishing holes will remain. If you want to proceed, we negotiate terms. Otherwise, your events are effectively canceled. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some homeowners cheered silently. Others looked horrified. Marlene, on the other hand, was caught between fury and disbelief. She waved her hands, tried to argue, but each point I made had a counter in law, deed, or liability. By the time the meeting ended, I had achieved 2 things. I retained my right to fish on my own lake, and I had placed the HOA in a legal straitjacket. They couldn't enforce a ban without risking a lawsuit, and they couldn't hold events without negotiating with me first. The following weekend, the HOA attempted to salvage their winter festival. They were cautiously optimistic, or maybe just desperate. I watched from my cabin as trucks arrived, carrying ice sculptures, sleds, and warming tents. It looked festive, almost normal. Almost. I had a plan. I grabbed my auger, thermos, and a few bags of brightly colored cones, then set out across the lake. My strategy was simple: maximize inconvenience without breaking a single law. Each hole I drilled was precisely calculated to interfere with foot traffic, sled races, and the ice sculpting area. I even added little flags with "Fishing hole, do not enter," written in bold letters. Soon, chaos unfolded. A group of volunteers tried to mark the skating path, only to stumble over my cleverly placed holes. One person nearly fell in. Another had to reroute an ice sculpture display when my clustered fishing zone encroached on their square footage. Every step they took required careful navigation. Smiles turned into grimaces. Marlene appeared at the edge of the lake, face red from cold and rage. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This is sabotage." "Actually," I said, standing near a deep cluster of holes, "this is exercising property rights. You're welcome to enjoy the lake. Just, watch your step." By mid-morning, the sled races had devolved into a slow, zigzag parade around fishing zones. Ice sculptures were moved haphazardly. Tents had to be relocated. And the warming fire ended up on the wrong side of the lake entirely. Parents and kids were confused. Event coordinators frustrated. My fishing hole grid had become a maze, a subtle yet effective blockade. Meanwhile, Marlene tried to rally volunteers, waving her clipboard like a sword. "We can still hold events," she cried. But every attempt to clear a path was thwarted by me. I strategically filled some holes with harmless snow, leaving uneven patches, then reopened them as they moved equipment. The lake became a puzzle, one that only I could solve. By late afternoon, the HOA had 2 options: call it quits, or navigate my fishing maze with extreme caution. Most chose the former. Kids trudged home, sculptures stayed incomplete, and the sled races were canceled. Marlene stormed toward me, furious. But even she knew arguing further would risk trespassing charges. I smiled, sipping my coffee, surveying the scene. My fishing holes weren't just interruptions, they were reminders. The HOA couldn't dictate ice usage on my property. Every hole drilled was a statement. This is my lake, my ice, my rules. And the best part? I hadn't broken any laws. Every move was calculated, legal, and perfectly defensible. They could scream, plead, or write letters. Nothing would change the outcome. My winter paradise remained mine. I walked back to my cabin, triumphant. My ice fishing season was safe, the lake was mine, and the HOA had learned an unforgettable lesson about overstepping boundaries. Winter stretched on, icy and relentless. But my victory had transformed the community dynamic. The HOA had stopped attempting to enforce the ban, and every event they tried to hold on my lake now required negotiation, and my terms. I had discovered the power of subtle leverage. Every hole in the ice was more than a fishing spot. It was a reminder that rules weren't absolute, especially when the property belonged to someone else. Families still skated on other parts of the lake, but they stayed within the paths I allowed. Like a carefully choreographed maze, the ice had become my domain, a chessboard where I controlled every move. Marlene predictably refused to admit defeat. She tried to recruit volunteers to restore order, but my legal groundwork made every intervention risky. Even minor corrections could have been interpreted as trespassing or harassment. She began holding meetings that were increasingly empty, her authority slowly eroding. And the neighbors? Quiet approval. Some even brought me coffee, subtle nods of solidarity. It was no longer about ice fishing. It was about fairness, control, and standing up for property rights. The final event of the season came in February, the annual Ice Sculpture Festival, a tradition the HOA cherished. I watched from a distance, a grin on my face, as Marlene tried to coordinate deliveries and setups. Every sculpture had to be carefully positioned around my fishing holes. Some volunteers nearly fell, others scrambled to adjust ice blocks. By mid-afternoon, only half the sculptures were finished. Frustrated, Marlene approached me. "Why won't you just cooperate?" she demanded. I shrugged. "I am cooperating. I just asked you to respect the boundaries of my property. Drill holes? Fill holes? That's my choice. If you want smooth ice, rent it legally or live with reality." Defeated, she walked away. For the first time that winter, I felt a quiet satisfaction. My fishing had gone uninterrupted. My property rights were unchallenged, and the HOA learned the hard way that authority has limits. By March, the ice began to melt. Holes disappeared, water returned to calm, and the lake slowly returned to its natural beauty. But the lessons of winter remained. Don't mess with the lake owner, and never underestimate someone willing to combine legal knowledge with a little ingenuity. I stood on the shore, rod in hand, watching the thawing water lap against the snow. The lake was peaceful again. My winter had been mine, every frozen morning a victory, and in the quiet ripples, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that ice, law, and determination could turn the tables, even on the most officious HOA. Winter had tested me. I had won, and the lake, as always, belonged to me.